The dust tasted like the end of the world. It was a fine red powder that coated Eleanor Monroe's tongue, settled in the creases of her eyelids, and worked its way into the very weave of her linen duster. The stagecoach groaned, its wheels complaining against the baked earth of Apache Pass. Outside, the Arizona territory shimmered under a sun that offered no mercy, only a hard, white glare that bleached the color from the sky. Giant saguaro cacti stood like silent, wounded sentinels, their arms raised in a permanent state of surrender. The air was thick with the sharp, resinous scent of creosote bush, the smell of a land that was all edges and thorns, a place that had learned to survive by being tough. Beside her, Miguel Ortega scribbled in a small, leather-bound notebook, his pencil a blur of motion. He was a reporter for a Spanish-language newspaper in Tucson, a man whose cheerful disposition seemed utterly out of place in the grim landscape. He caught her looking and flashed a grin, his teeth startlingly white in his sun-darkened face. "Documenting our slow crawl toward civilization. Miss Monroe," he asked, his English carrying the melodic lilt of his native tongue, "or perhaps our descent into a particularly well-heated purgatory?" Eleanor offered a faint smile. "I am not sure there is a difference." "Mr. Ortega, at least not in July." She shifted, the weight of her medical bag a familiar comfort against her hip. Inside, alongside the laudanum and sterile bandages, was her other tool of the trade, a heavy camera lens, carefully wrapped in velvet. She was a nurse by profession, but a photographer by heart. She captured the truth of this land, not just its fevers and its wounds, but the stark, unforgiving beauty of its face, the deep lines etched into its canyons, the stories held in the eyes of its people. The coach carried 6 passengers. Across from them sat a nervous-looking man in a dusty suit, clutching a briefcase to his chest. Beside him, a young mother. Sarah tried to soothe her son, a boy of about 7 named Thomas, who fidgeted restlessly. The heat and the endless jolting were wearing on everyone's nerves. The only sound was the rhythmic clop of the horse's hooves and the driver's occasional curse, swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence. The attack came without warning. One moment, the coach was lumbering through a narrow cut in the rocks. The next, the world exploded into chaos. A volley of gunshots cracked the air, splintering the wooden frame of the coach. The horses screamed and reared. The driver yelled, a sharp, terrified sound, and the coach lurched to a violent stop, throwing Eleanor hard against Miguel. "Get down," Miguel shouted, pushing her toward the floor as another bullet whizzed through the open window. Outside, painted men on horseback swarmed the coach. They wore leather leggings and had their faces smeared with red and black paint. But something was wrong. Their movements were clumsy, their horsemanship lacking the fluid grace Eleanor had seen in the few peaceful encounters she had witnessed with local tribes. They whooped and hollered, but it sounded like a performance, a hollow imitation. The door was wrenched open, and a man with a rifle and cruel eyes beneath his sloppy paint job loomed in the opening. "Out!" he growled, his voice a low rasp that held no trace of an Apache accent. "All of you, now." Panic filled the small space. The man in the suit scrambled out first, his hands raised high. Miguel followed, his reporter's curiosity warring with his instinct for self-preservation. He kept his hands visible, his expression calm. Eleanor helped the young mother and her son, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She kept her medical bag clutched tight. A life's work was in that bag, both for healing and for seeing. They were herded to the side of the road while 2 of the men ransacked the coach, throwing mail bags and luggage onto the dusty ground. Another stood guard over them, his rifle held loosely but menacingly. Eleanor's eyes scanned the scene, her mind cataloging details with the precision of a camera lens. The beadwork on one man's vest was poorly done. Another wore scuffed riding boots, not moccasins. These were not Apache warriors. These were white men playing a deadly game of make-believe. The man in the suit was shoved forward. "The box," the leader demanded, pointing at the briefcase. The man fumbled with the latch, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work it. He opened it to reveal stacks of paper money. The leader grunted in satisfaction and snatched the case. Then his eyes fell on Sarah, who was trying to shield her son behind her skirts. Thomas, pale with terror, peeked out from behind his mother. The leader's gaze lingered, and a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. He took a step toward them. "Now hold on," Miguel said, taking a half-step forward. "There is no need for that." The guard swung his rifle around, the barrel catching Miguel squarely in the ribs. He grunted and doubled over. The air driven from his lungs, the leader ignored him, his focus entirely on the mother and child. "Let's have a look at the boy," he said, his voice greasy with amusement. Eleanor felt a cold knot of fury tighten in her stomach. She had seen enough suffering in this territory, enough casual cruelty inflicted by the strong upon the weak. This she would not watch. Her hand slipped from her medical bag to the small, two-barreled derringer she kept tucked in a pocket of her duster. It was a lady's gun, easily concealed, but at this range, it would be effective. As the man reached for Thomas, Sarah let out a small, choked sob. In that instant, Eleanor moved. She stepped forward, positioning herself between the outlaw and the family. "Leave the boy alone," she said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. The man laughed. "A short, barking sound. And who's going to stop me, you little nurse?" His laughter died in his throat as she raised the small pistol, its twin barrels aimed squarely at his chest. The other men froze, surprised by the sudden shift in the standoff. The leader's eyes narrowed. He had not expected this. "You've got nerve," he sneered, but he did not move closer. "You really think that little pea shooter is going to make a difference?" "It will make a difference to you," Eleanor replied, her gaze unwavering. "Now, back away from them." A tense silence stretched, broken only by the buzzing of a fly and the ragged sound of Thomas's frightened breaths. The world seemed to hold its breath. The leader stared at her, weighing his options. He could call her bluff, but there was a conviction in her eyes that gave him pause. It was the same look he had seen in cornered animals, a look that promised a high price for any further aggression. Before he could decide, a new sound cut through the tension. The sharp, clear report of a single, powerful rifle shot echoed from the rocks above them. It was not aimed at the passengers or the outlaws. It struck the ground just inches from the leader's boot, kicking up a puff of red dust. Everyone looked up. Perched on a high ledge overlooking the pass was the silhouette of a lone rider on a muscular pinto horse. He was still as a statue, a figure of daunting authority. He wore no paint, only simple buckskins. A dark bandana covered the lower half of his face, and his eyes, even from this distance, were shadowed and intense. He held a Winchester rifle, its barrel still smoking slightly. He was lean, but he carried himself with an air of coiled strength, a predator in his natural element. He was Apache, unmistakably, authentically Apache. The fake bandits stared, their bravado evaporating like a raindrop on a hot skillet. This was not part of their plan. This was a complication they had no wish to deal with. The rider on the ledge fired again. This time, the bullet tore the hat from one of the outlaw's heads, sending it spinning into the dust. It was not a warning shot. It was a statement of skill, a promise. The leader of the gang needed no more convincing. "Forget it," he snarled to his men. "Let's go." They scrambled for their horses, clumsy in their haste. They abandoned the mailbags and the passengers' luggage, taking only the briefcase of money. Within seconds, they were gone, their horses kicking up a cloud of dust as they galloped away down the pass, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. The pass fell silent again. The man in the suit sagged with relief. Sarah knelt and hugged her son tightly, murmuring words of comfort. Miguel pushed himself upright, wincing as he held his ribs. Eleanor kept her derringer trained on the empty road, her knuckles white. Only when she was certain they were not coming back did she lower it. her hand shaking slightly from the adrenaline. She looked up at the ledge. The lone rider was making his way down a narrow, almost invisible trail in the rock face. He moved with a quiet confidence that was both unsettling and mesmerizing. He did not dismount until he reached the road, his pinto horse standing obediently as he swung a leg over. He walked toward them, his steps silent in the dust. He was taller than he had seemed from the ledge. His shoulders were broad beneath the buckskin shirt. His hair was long and black, held back by a simple leather band. The bandana still covered his nose and mouth, drawing all attention to his eyes. They were dark and intelligent, and they missed nothing. They swept over the scene, taking in the scattered luggage, the frightened passengers, and finally, they settled on Eleanor. He stopped a few feet from her. He gave no greeting, offered no explanation. His gaze dropped to the small pistol still in her hand, then rose again to meet hers. For a long moment, he just looked at her, an unreadable expression in his dark eyes. It was not threatening, but it was deeply assessing, as if he were taking her measure. Then he reached into a small pouch at his belt. Eleanor tensed, but he moved slowly, deliberately. He withdrew a small object and held it out to her. It was a smooth, flat stone of brilliant turquoise, polished by time and touch, strung on a simple leather cord, a talisman. He stepped forward, and before she could react, he took her hand, the one holding the derringer. His touch was surprisingly warm, his fingers calloused but gentle. He curled her fingers around the cool stone, his thumb pressing it into her palm. "Keep your life first," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath their feet. "Your word second." And that was all. He released her hand, turned without another glance, and swung back onto his horse. He guided the pinto not back up the trail, but toward a narrow, shadowed canyon that seemed to appear out of the solid rock wall. Horse and rider were swallowed by the shadows, and in a heartbeat, they were gone. Eleanor stood frozen, the turquoise warm in her palm, the echo of his words hanging in the silent, heated air. Miguel finally found his voice. He limped over to her, still clutching his side. "Well, Miss Monroe," he said, his tone a mixture of awe and bewilderment. He glanced from the empty canyon to the small gun in her hand. "When you decided to intervene, did you shoot at his hat? Or was that the Lord's favor lending a hand?" Eleanor looked down at the talisman. It felt solid, real, a tangible piece of a puzzle she did not understand. A man disguised as an Apache attacks them, and a true Apache saves them. Nothing in this territory was ever what it seemed. The line between truth and deception was as thin and shifting as a trail in the sand. "I think," she said softly, closing her fingers tightly around the stone, "that this time the wind was on my side." Fort Bowie smelled of lye, carbolic acid, and dust. The scent was a world away from the creosote and open air of the pass, a sterile imposition on the wild landscape. The fort itself was a collection of sturdy adobe buildings arranged with military precision around a parade ground, all of it baking under the same relentless sun. It was an outpost of order in a land that defied it, and the tension was a palpable thing, thick as the heat that radiated from the packed earth. Eleanor Monroe had been given a small room attached to the infirmary, a clean, whitewashed space that felt both like a sanctuary and a cage. Dr. Adams, the post surgeon, was a man worn smooth by years of mending broken bodies. He was overworked, perpetually tired, and deeply grateful for her presence. Her temporary contract was to assist with the usual run of fevers, infections, and injuries that plagued any frontier garrison. On her second day, the fort was buzzing with a grim energy. Captain Harlan Pike had returned from a patrol and was making his report, not just to his commanding officer, but to the small gathering of anxious civilians and off-duty soldiers near the flagpole. Eleanor, on her way to the mess for a cup of coffee, found her path blocked by the crowd and stopped to listen. Captain Pike was a man carved from the very rock of the territory. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and eyes the color of a pale winter sky. His uniform was immaculate despite the dust, and he radiated an aura of unshakable confidence that the people around him seemed to draw on like water from a well. He stood before a rough wooden table where a collection of items was displayed on a government-issue woolen blanket. "They struck the mail coach in the past 2 days ago," Pike announced, his voice carrying with the easy command of a man used to being obeyed. "This is what they left behind." He gestured to the table. An arrow, Apache fletching, a leather pouch, Chiricahua design. They made off with a strongbox, but their greed made them careless. Eleanor edged closer, her gaze drawn to the evidence. The arrow looked authentic enough, as did the pouch, but beside them, gleaming in the harsh sunlight, lay a small pile of brass shell casings. Pike picked one up, holding it between his thumb and forefinger for all to see. "They are getting bolder," he declared. "Using repeating rifles now. Stolen, no doubt. These casings are the proof. The Chiricahua have broken the treaty. They are raiding with impunity." A murmur of fear and anger rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt a cold stillness settle over her. She knew guns. She knew ammunition. Her father had taught her. And she knew what she was looking at. Her eyes, trained by the meticulous process of photography to notice the smallest detail, saw the tiny, stamped marking on the base of the cartridge. It was not a military-issue casing, nor was it the sort used by common frontiersmen. It was the mark of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, the hired guns of railroad magnates and mining tycoons. Her suspicions from the past solidified into a cold, hard certainty. This was a lie, staged and performed for a terrified audience. She looked at Captain Pike, at his handsome, earnest face, and wondered if he was a knowing participant or simply a fool. The conviction in his voice felt genuine, but she had learned long ago that the most dangerous lies are the ones men tell themselves. She slipped away from the crowd, the captain's words ringing in her ears, a hollow counterpoint to the memory of a masked rider and a turquoise stone. That night, sleep would not come. The heat lingered in her small room, and the fort was unnervingly quiet. She sat at her small desk, cleaning the glass plates for her camera by the light of a single kerosene lamp. The process was meditative, the familiar scent of collodion and silver nitrate a small comfort in this place of secrets. A faint scratching sound at her window made her freeze. It came again, soft but insistent. Her heart leaped into her throat. She slowly rose, her hand reaching for the heavy iron poker by the small stove. She moved to the window and peered through a gap in the simple cotton curtain. A figure stood in the shadows just beyond the reach of the lamplight. For a moment, all she saw was a silhouette. Then the figure moved slightly, and the light caught the edge of a familiar buckskin shirt, the shape of a strong shoulder. She saw the dark bandana covering the lower half of his face. It was him, the rider from the pass. Her breath caught. What could he possibly want here, at the heart of the place that had sworn to be his enemy? She hesitated, her mind racing. To call for the guard would be to sign his death warrant. To open the window felt like an act of madness. She remembered his low voice, the feel of the turquoise stone in her hand. "Keep your life first, your word second." She had given no word. He must have sensed her presence, her indecision. He raised a hand, not in a threat, but in a quiet, placating gesture. Then he gestured toward the infirmary door. He needed to get inside. Eleanor's mind worked quickly. Dr. Adams was a heavy sleeper, his quarters on the far side of the compound. The infirmary was empty tonight, the few patients resting quietly. She was alone, taking a deep, steadying breath. She moved away from the window, picked up her lamp, and walked to the infirmary's back door, the one that opened into the shadowed alley between the buildings. Her hand trembled as she slid the bolt. She opened the door a crack. He was there instantly, moving with a silence that was unnerving. He slipped inside, and she quickly bolted the door behind him. In the enclosed space, he seemed even larger, a piece of the wild, untamed land brought indoors. His eyes, dark and intense, met hers over the bandana. He was not alone. He shifted, revealing a second person he had been supporting, a slender figure who leaned heavily against him. It was a young woman, no older than 18. Her face was contorted in pain, and her buckskin dress was dark with blood high on her left shoulder. She was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. "Help her," the man said. It was the same low, gravelly voice from the pass. It held no plea, only a flat statement of need. Eleanor became a nurse again. The fear receded, replaced by a focused calm. "Bring her to the table," she commanded, her voice crisp and professional. He helped the young woman onto the examination table, his movements surprisingly gentle. She sank onto the cot, her eyes closing for a moment against a wave of pain. Eleanor brought the lamp closer. The wound was bad. A gunshot, high on the clavicle. It was bleeding sluggishly, the area around it already swollen and bruised. "I need to get the bullet out," she said, her hands already moving, gathering forceps, probes, and clean linen from a cabinet. "It will hurt." The young woman opened her eyes. They were the same dark, intelligent eyes as the man's, but they flashed with a fiery spirit, even through the pain. "I am stronger than I look," she whispered in a strained voice. Eleanor turned back to the man. He stood by the table, a sentinel watching over his charge. A rifle was slung over his back, and a long knife was sheathed at his belt. He was an armed warrior in a United States Army infirmary, a walking contradiction, an impossibility. "I cannot help her with you standing there like that," Eleanor said, her voice even. "I need you to put the rifle and the knife on the floor, over there, by the door." He did not move for a long moment. His eyes searched her face, probing, questioning. She could feel the weight of his mistrust, his lifetime of reasons not to trust anyone with her skin color, her clothes, her presence in this place. She met his gaze without flinching, letting him see the sincerity in her own. She was not a soldier. She was not a threat. She was a healer. Slowly, deliberately, he unslung the Winchester rifle. He laid it carefully on the floor, making almost no sound. Then he drew the knife from its sheath. The blade was long and formidable. He placed it beside the rifle. He straightened up, his hands now empty at his sides. "My sister, Tala," he said, his voice quiet. "The bullet is lead. It needs to come out soon." He spoke English with a calm fluency that surprised her, the words measured and precise. This was not the broken speech of a man struggling with a foreign tongue. This was the language of an equal. That was the moment the world shifted. Her choice was clear. This was not about politics or treaties or the lies told on the parade ground. This was about a young woman bleeding on a table, and a brother who had risked everything to save her. It was about the quiet space of a healer's room, where all that mattered was the wound and the will to mend it. She was stepping into a gray area, a dangerous middle ground between two warring worlds. And she knew, with a sudden, gut-deep certainty, that there was no turning back. "I will need to boil some water," Eleanor said, turning to the stove. She was all business now. "And you can help me hold her steady." As she worked, preparing her instruments, she glanced at her small workbench. On one side lay a neatly folded, blood-stained strip of an army uniform, cut from the sleeve of a cavalryman who had taken a bad fall from his horse earlier that day. On the other side, she laid out a small pot of a soothing herbal salve she had made herself from yucca root and desert sage. The two items sat side by side under the lamplight, the blood of the fort and the medicine of the land. Proof of two different worlds. And here she was, in the dead of night, trying to bridge the impossible distance between them. The journey was a silent one, a passage through a landscape of ghosts. Dazin moved with an economy of motion that Eleanor found herself trying to emulate, placing her feet where he placed his. conserving her energy against the oppressive heat of the pre-dawn hours. They had slipped out of Fort Bowie under the cover of a moonless sky, leaving the world of straight lines and bugle calls behind for a realm of winding canyons and ancient, patient stone. He had retrieved his weapons, and now the rifle on his back seemed as much a part of him as his own limbs. Tala, weak but resolute, rode his pinto. Dazin walked ahead, leading a second horse for Eleanor, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain, reading a language in the rocks and sand that was invisible to her. He did not speak, and she did not ask questions. The silence was a space of concentration, a shared understanding that their survival depended on being unseen and unheard. Just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, he turned from the main wash they had been following and guided them into a fissure in a rock wall so narrow she had not even registered it as a path. The air immediately grew cooler. The trail twisted and climbed, a secret artery into the heart of the mountains. After another hour of careful ascent, the narrow passage opened abruptly, and Eleanor gasped. They stood at the edge of a hidden valley. It was not large, perhaps a mile across, but it was a world of impossible green cradled in the arms of the red. Sun-baked mountains, a clear stream, small but lively, snaked through a meadow dotted with wildflowers. Patches of corn and squash grew in neat rows near a collection of wickiups, simple dome-shaped dwellings of willow branches and grass that seemed to have sprouted from the earth itself. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and juniper. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary carved out of the harshness of the territory. A few people moved among the dwellings, their motions unhurried. An old man, his face a beautiful map of wrinkles, looked up as they approached. He did not seem surprised to see them, or her. His gaze was calm and deeply intelligent. Dazin stopped before him and spoke in his own tongue, his voice soft but respectful. The old man listened, his eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. Dazin turned to her. He gestured toward the elder. "This is Nakai," he said. "He is a healer. He knows the ways of the plants." Nakai gave a slight, formal nod. "The white woman's hands are steady," he said in his own language, and Dazin translated without being asked. "But the poison of the lead remains." Eleanor understood. She had removed the bullet, but the real healing was a longer, more complicated process. She had brought her own medicines, but she recognized in Nakai a knowledge that was deeper, rooted in this specific soil. She returned his nod with one of her own, and gesture of respect from one healer to another. They took Tala to a clean, airy wickiup where she was laid upon soft furs. Eleanor examined the wound. It was clean, the stitches holding well, but the flesh around it was hot and inflamed. Tala watched her, her dark eyes sharp despite the feverish glaze. "Dazin's sister has a question for you," Dazin said, a faint trace of something that might have been amusement in his voice. "She asks if your aim with a needle is better than your aim with a pistol." Eleanor met the young woman's challenging gaze and allowed herself a small, tired smile. "On the pass, the wind was with me," she replied honestly. "Here, I do not need the wind." A flicker of respect, or perhaps just surprise, showed in Tala's eyes before she winced from a fresh wave of pain. For the next few days, Eleanor's world shrank to the size of that wickiup. She worked alongside Nakai, a silent partnership forming between them. She used her carbolic acid to keep the wound clean, and he showed her how to mash the leaves of the lorea bush, the common creosote, into a poultice that drew out the inflammation and eased the pain. He taught her that the root of the yucca plant, when pounded and mixed with water, created a gentle soap that did not irritate the skin. She watched, she learned, and she began to understand that medicine was more than just science. It was a conversation with the land itself. During the long, quiet hours, Eleanor found herself observing Dazin. He was not the stoic, silent warrior she had first imagined. She saw him speak with his people, his voice low and patient. She saw him crouch down to listen to a child's story, his stern features softening. She saw him laugh once, a deep, genuine sound, as Tala, feeling stronger, told him a story that made him shake his head in disbelief. And one afternoon, as he watched Eleanor carefully change Tala's dressing, she looked up and saw him smile at her. It was not a large smile. It was a small, quiet lifting at the corners of his mouth, but it transformed his face, chasing the shadows from his eyes. In that moment, he was not just an Apache chief. He was a man, a brother, relieved and grateful. As Tala's fever broke and her strength began to return, Eleanor found she had time to breathe, to see the valley not just as a refuge, but as a community. She had brought her camera equipment with her, carefully bundled on the pack horse. One afternoon, feeling the need to ground herself in the familiar, she unpacked the heavy wooden box, the brass lens, the bottles of chemicals. The children watched her from a safe distance, their curiosity a palpable force. She set up the tripod, a strange, three-legged creature in the middle of the meadow. She disappeared under the dark cloth, the world outside reduced to an upside-down, shimmering image on the ground glass. She was not looking for a subject. She was simply looking. She framed a shot of the stream, the way the light caught the ripples in the water. She focused on the texture of a saguaro skeleton, its woody ribs a testament to a long life. She was adjusting the focus when Dazin's shadow fell across the glass. She emerged from under the cloth. He stood a few feet away, watching her, his expression unreadable. "You capture shadows," he said. It was not a question. "I capture light," she corrected gently. "The light that falls on things. It is how I see the truth." He considered this for a moment. His gaze went from the strange contraption of wood and brass to her face. "And what truth do you see here?" She looked around the valley, at the wiki-ups, at the children now chasing a lizard in the dust, at Tala sitting in the sun outside her dwelling, at the old man Nakai tending his small garden of medicinal herbs. "I see a home," she said. "I see people trying to live, the same as the people in the town, the same as the soldiers in the fort." He did not reply immediately. He looked at his valley as if seeing it through her eyes, through the strange, single eye of her machine. "The soldiers see a wilderness that must be tamed," he said finally, his voice low. "The men who want the water see an obstacle. They do not see a home. Your shadow box sees more clearly than they do." He gave a slight nod, a gesture of permission, and walked away, leaving her with her camera and a profound sense of a door having been opened. She had shown him a piece of her soul, and he had not turned away. The next day, a scout returned to the valley, a young man who had moved like a ghost through the territory. He spoke with Dazin for a long time, his voice low and urgent. When Dazin came to find Eleanor, the smile was gone. The shadows were back in his eyes. "There is talk at the fort," he said, his voice flat. "And in the town. They say the nurse from Fort Bowie ran away. They say she went with the Apache." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. The safe, warm cocoon of the valley suddenly felt fragile, a thin membrane between her and a world that would not understand, a world that would judge her, condemn her, and likely hang the man standing in front of her if they found him. Her decision to help had not been a single act in a darkened infirmary. It was a choice that now had consequences, ripples spreading out into the world, growing larger and more dangerous with every passing day. She had followed her conscience into this hidden valley. Now she wondered if it would lead her, and these people, to ruin. The return to the world of men was a journey through a different kind of wilderness. Dazin led her through the labyrinth of canyons under the faint starlight, his presence a silent, comforting shield against the dangers of the night. He left her on a ridge overlooking the small, dusty town of Wilcox just as the sky began to soften to a bruised purple. He did not say goodbye. He simply paused, his dark eyes meeting hers, and the space between them was filled with 1,000 unspoken words. "The river is the lifeblood," he said, his voice a low rumble. "For my people, for your town, For the cattle. Some men do not care if the land bleeds, as long as they can collect the blood in a silver cup. Watch the river, Eleanor Monroe. Then he melted back into the shadows, leaving her alone with the sleeping town and the weight of his warning. She made her way into Wilcox as the first workers were stirring, a ghost returning to a life she was no longer sure was hers. She found a room to let above the general store, a small, clean space that felt vast and empty after the close community of the valley. Her first stop was the telegraph office, where she sent a carefully worded wire to the hospital in Tucson, citing a family emergency as the reason for her departure from Fort Bowie. It was a flimsy lie, but it was the best she could do. She found Miguel Ortega in the town's only saloon, which doubled as a restaurant. He was eating breakfast and trying to coax a story out of a tight-lipped cattle rancher. When he saw her walk in, he dropped his fork with a clatter. "Miss Monroe," he breathed, rushing to her side. "By all the saints, we thought you were dead, or worse, the stories." "The stories are not true," Eleanor said, her voice weary. "I am a nurse. Mr. Ortega, I go where I am needed." His reporter's eyes were sharp, missing none of the exhaustion in her face or the new, wary tension in her shoulders. He led her to his table and ordered her coffee and food. He did not press her for details, not at first. He simply let her sit, letting the familiar clatter of a town waking up wash over her. It was later that morning, after she had eaten, that he brought up the subject again. They were walking along the town's main street, a wide, dusty thoroughfare of false-fronted buildings. "Captain Pike has declared the treaty broken," Miguel said, his tone grim. "He has used the stagecoach robbery and your disappearance as proof of Apache hostility. People are scared. They are also angry." "The men who robbed the coach were not Apache," Eleanor stated flatly, "and Captain Pike has evidence that proves it, whether he knows it or not." She told him about the Pinkerton shell casings. Miguel stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide. "Pinkertons, that means someone with a great deal of money is funding this chaos." She finished for him. "Someone who wants the Apache blamed. Someone who benefits if the army drives them from their land." "The land?" Miguel murmured, his mind clearly racing. "Magnus Voss, the railroad man, has been buying up land claims all over this territory, but the valley where the Chiricahua live, and the river that runs through it, that is protected by the treaty." Before Eleanor could respond, a woman's voice cut through the morning air, sharp and clear. "Ortega, you are supposed to be interviewing the blacksmith, not gossiping in the street." Eleanor turned to see a woman in a plain, practical dress with a sheriff's star pinned to her vest. She had a calm, steady face and intelligent gray eyes that took in everything at a glance. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and a Colt revolver sat comfortably on her hip. "Deputy Ruth Calloway," Miguel said, making the introductions. "This is Miss Eleanor Monroe, the nurse from Fort Bowie." Deputy Calloway's gaze on Eleanor was direct and assessing. She did not look shocked or judgmental, merely interested. "I heard you were gone," she said, her voice neutral. "The rumors of my demise have been greatly exaggerated," Eleanor replied, matching the deputy's dry tone. "So I see," Ruth said. "The captain is not a man who likes loose ends. You should be careful." She looked from Eleanor to Miguel. "What were you two whispering about that was so important?" Eleanor made a decision. She trusted the quiet strength in the deputy's eyes, the sense of a woman who valued facts over hysteria. She told her about the shell casings. Ruth listened without interruption, her expression unchanging. When Eleanor finished, she was silent for a long moment. "Pike is a soldier," she said finally. "He sees what he's trained to see, but that casing, that is a different kind of trouble." She looked toward the low line of mountains to the east, where the river flowed. "Let's take a ride." The three of them rode out an hour later, following the sluggish, brown river as it wound its way through the dry landscape. The water was lower than Eleanor had ever seen it. Dazin's words echoed in her mind. They found the survey stakes a few miles upstream. They were new, freshly driven into the hard soil, marking out a wide swath of land along the riverbank. "This is wrong," Ruth said, dismounting to examine one of the stakes. "The land grant for this section belongs to the Blackwood family. Has for 20 years. These markers are well inside their property line." "And on the wrong side of the river," Miguel added, pointing. "The treaty line is a half-mile to the east." "Someone is redrawing the map," Ruth concluded, her voice grim. She pulled a folded, much-used topographical map from her saddlebag and spread it on the ground. "According to this, these stakes mark the foundation for a dam." "A dam would choke the river," Eleanor said, a cold dread seeping into her. "It would dry up the valley." "It would," Ruth agreed, "and give whoever controls the dam complete power over every ranch and settlement downstream, including Wilcox." Their discovery was cut short by a low, powerful boom that rolled across the plains, echoing off the distant mountains. It was the sound of dynamite. The ground beneath their feet trembled slightly. Before they could even process the sound, a new one reached them, a low rumble that grew steadily louder, a sound like thunder. But it was not coming from the sky. It was coming from the north. "Stampede," Ruth said, her voice tight as she swung back into her saddle. "That blast must have spooked Blackwood's herd." From a rise, they saw it, a terrifying rolling wave of brown and white, a river of horns and hooves, 500 head of longhorn cattle running blind with panic, directly toward a small cluster of buildings nestled in a cottonwood grove. "The schoolhouse," Eleanor breathed, her blood running cold. "The children—" They spurred their horses, racing toward the schoolhouse, but they knew they would never make it in time. The herd was too big, too fast. The small building and the adjacent corral where the children sometimes played would be trampled into kindling. Then, from the rocks to the east, a lone rider appeared. He rode not away from the herd, but toward it, his pinto horse moving with incredible speed and agility. It was Dazin. He rode parallel to the surging tide of cattle, firing his rifle into the air, trying to turn the lead steers. He saw them, and for a fleeting second, his eyes met Eleanor's. There was no time for words. He pointed with his rifle toward a narrow cut in the rocks just beyond the schoolhouse, a small arroyo that could potentially divert the herd. Eleanor understood. It was their only chance. "Ruth, Miguel. We have to turn them," she shouted over the roar. The three of them angled their horses, joining Dazin in the desperate effort, becoming a small, determined wall of flesh and bone against the mindless force of the stampede. The air was a choking storm of dust and the smell of terrified animals. Dazin was magnificent, a master of his horse and the land. He weaved in and out of the edge of the herd, a blur of motion, forcing the lead animals to veer slightly to the east. Eleanor followed his lead, her heart pounding in her chest, her horse skittish beneath her. She saw the children then, their small, terrified faces pressed against the schoolhouse window. The teacher, a young woman, was trying to herd them into the small but sturdy adobe building. Two small boys, however, had been in the corral and were now trapped, huddled against the flimsy wooden fence as the tide of cattle bore down on them. Dazin saw them too. He changed tactics instantly, breaking away from the main herd and riding directly for the corral. Eleanor was right behind him. They reached the fence just as the first longhorn smashed into it. The wood splintered. Dazin leaped from his horse, pulling one boy up and practically throwing him over the saddle. Eleanor dismounted, grabbing the other boy, her arms wrapping around him as she shielded him with her body against the press of animal flesh. A steer's horn grazed her arm, ripping her sleeve. The fence gave way completely. Dazin, now back on his horse with the child in front of him, yelled and waved his rifle, creating a small island of chaos that parted the animals around them just enough. He rode through the gap, pulling Eleanor and the boy she held with him into the relative safety of the open ground on the other side. Just as quickly as it began, it was over. The last of the herd thundered past, diverted by Ruth and Miguel into the arroyo. A sudden, ringing silence descended, broken by the frightened sobs of the child in Eleanor's arms. She was covered in dust and sweat. Her arm was bleeding, but she was alive. The children were safe. She looked at Dazin, who was helping the other boy down from his horse. His face was a mask of dust. His jaw set. He looked at her, his eyes taking in her torn sleeve. The blood, a flicker of something, concern or perhaps anger, crossed his face before it was gone. The sound of approaching horses made them both turn. It was not Ruth and Miguel. It was Captain Harlan Pike and a patrol of 6 cavalrymen, their blue uniforms a stark, jarring sight against the dusty landscape. They rode up and surrounded them, their rifles held at the ready. Pike's cold blue eyes fixed on Eleanor, then moved to Dazin, who stood unmoving beside his horse. Pike's lip curled in a triumphant sneer. "Well, Miss Monroe," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "it seems the rumors were true after all. Consorting with the enemy." He gestured to Dazin. "Arrest him." 2 soldiers dismounted, moving toward Dazin. He did not resist. He simply stood tall, his dark eyes burning with a silent, contained fury. "And you, Miss Monroe," Pike continued, turning his attention back to her. "Your contract with the Army is hereby terminated. You are a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. You will be confined to your quarters in town until further notice." His gaze fell on her medical bag and the larger satchel on her horse that contained her camera. "I will be confiscating your personal effects as evidence." He had found her. It was not a raid on a medicine tent, but it was a raid nonetheless. It was an act of intimidation, an attempt to silence her. He wanted her camera. He wanted her shadows and her light. He was afraid of what she had seen. As his men began to take her things, Deputy Ruth Calloway and Miguel rode up. Ruth took in the scene with one quick, sweeping glance, her face impassive. She positioned her horse between Pike and Eleanor. "Captain," she said, her voice calm but firm, "Miss Monroe is a civilian, and she is in my jurisdiction now. Any confining will be done by the book, through my office. And as for her property, you have no warrant to seize it." Pike's face hardened. "This is a military matter, Deputy." "This was a stampede that endangered the children of this town," Ruth countered, her voice like steel. "That makes it a town matter, my matter. Your patrol can escort the prisoner back to Fort Bowie. Miss Monroe will stay with me." Pike stared at her, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He was a captain of the United States Cavalry, but here, in this town, the woman with the tin star held a power he could not easily dismiss. He finally gave a curt, angry nod. His soldiers led Dazin away. A prisoner. Eleanor watched him go, a profound sense of failure and dread washing over her. She had brought this upon him. After Pike and his men were gone, Ruth turned to her. The deputy's gray eyes were serious. She looked at Eleanor, at the dust, the blood, and the fierce, defiant set of her jaw. "He is not a stupid man," Ruth said quietly. "He is scared of you, scared of what you know, or what he thinks you know." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "You just bought yourself a whole world of trouble. Miss Monroe, you owe me a big truth. I suggest you figure out what it is, and fast." Dazin's escape from Fort Bowie was not an escape at all. It was an exchange. 2 nights after his capture, as Eleanor sat in her small room above the general store, feeling the walls close in around her, a pebble struck her window pane. It was Tala, her face grim in the moonlight, a coiled rope in her hand and 2 saddled horses waiting in the alley below. "The Army," she explained in a low, urgent whisper, "held her brother. But the Apache held something the Army wanted more, a young lieutenant, the son of a powerful senator, who had foolishly wandered too far from his patrol and been taken without a sound. The exchange was to happen at dawn, in a neutral canyon miles from any settlement. but word had reached Tala that it was a trap. Pike intended to get his lieutenant back and eliminate Dassen in the ensuing chaos. They had to get him out before the sun rose. Following Tala through the sleeping fort was like following a shadow. They moved with a silence Eleanor would not have thought possible, using the deep pockets of darkness cast by the adobe walls. Tala dispatched the lone guard outside the small stockade with a swift, non-lethal blow to the back of the head. The lock on Dassen's cell was a simple iron bar, easily lifted. He was not surprised to see them. He emerged from the darkness of the cell, and, for a moment, he and Tala spoke in their own language, a rapid exchange of information. Then he turned to Eleanor, and in the faint starlight, she saw the question in his eyes. She had come for him. She had crossed the final line. The wind began to rise as they rode east, a low, mournful sound that whipped sand into their faces. By the time they reached the rendezvous point, the canyon where the exchange was meant to take place, the sky was a churning, sickly yellow. The air was thick with dust, the sun a pale, impotent wafer behind the haze. A sandstorm was coming, a full-blown desert tempest. "Pike will not come in this," Tala said, her voice muffled by the bandana she had pulled over her nose and mouth. "But he will have men watching the passes. We cannot go back to the valley." "There is a place," Dassen said, his voice raised to be heard over the rising howl of the wind. "A place of shelter. We must go now." He led them on a desperate ride, not away from the storm, but into its teeth. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of stinging sand and screaming wind. Eleanor could see nothing but the faint outline of Dassen's back as he leaned low over his horse's neck. She trusted him. She had no other choice. Just as she felt her strength failing, he veered sharply and plunged down a steep embankment into what felt like a crack in the earth. The sound of the wind lessened immediately. Though the air was still thick with choking dust, they were in a narrow, high-walled canyon, a deep scar in the desert floor. He led them another 100 yards until they reached a low opening in the rock face, partially obscured by a fall of ancient boulders. Inside, the world was transformed. The roar of the storm became a distant, muted howl. They were in a cave, but it was unlike any cave Eleanor had ever seen. A large, still pool of water filled the center of the cavern, steam rising from its surface in soft, ghostly tendrils. The air was warm and humid, a welcome relief from the dry, abrasive wind outside. A faint, sulphurous smell hung in the air, the scent of water drawn from deep within the earth. "The ancestors found this place," Dassen said, his voice echoing slightly in the large chamber. "A place of healing." Tala, exhausted, immediately found a dry ledge and curled up, pulling a saddle blanket over her. Within minutes, she was asleep. Eleanor slid from her horse, her muscles screaming in protest. Every inch of her body ached. Her face was raw from the sand, her eyes burned, and her throat felt like sandpaper. She moved toward the pool, drawn by the warmth. Dassen was unsaddling the horses, his movements slow and deliberate. When he was finished, he came to stand beside her. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the steam rise from the water, listening to the muffled fury of the storm outside. They had passed through the fire and found this quiet, steamy sanctuary. "Your arm," he said, his gaze on the crude bandage she had tied around the gash from the stampede. It had started bleeding again during the hard ride. She had almost forgotten about it. She untied the bandana, revealing the angry, inflamed cut. He looked at it, his expression unreadable in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. "The water will clean it," he said. "It has minerals. It will help the healing." He began to unlace his buckskin shirt. "We are covered in the dust of the storm. It is better to wash it away." It was not an invitation, but a simple statement of fact. He pulled the shirt over his head, revealing a body that was a tapestry of scars. A long, thin white line ran across his ribs. A puckered circle of raised flesh marked his shoulder, the entry point of an old bullet. These were the marks of a life lived at the sharp edge of the world. He moved to the edge of the pool and, without hesitation, stepped into the water, his back to her. Eleanor watched him for a moment. The steam swirled around his broad shoulders. He was a man of this land, as elemental as the rock and the wind. The fear she had carried with her for days, the constant, gnawing anxiety, began to recede, replaced by a profound sense of weariness and something else, a feeling of safety. Here, in this hidden place, with this man, the world outside could not touch them. She slowly began to unbutton her dress, her fingers clumsy and stiff. The layers of clothing felt heavy, confining, coated with the grime of their flight. She shed them, piece by piece, until she stood in her simple cotton chemise. She hesitated for only a second before stepping into the pool. The water was a shock, a deep, penetrating heat that soothed her aching muscles and seemed to melt the tension from her very bones. It was a baptism, a washing away of the fear and the lies. She sank up to her shoulders, the water buoying her, and let out a long, slow breath. Dazin had kept his distance, respecting her privacy. He was on the far side of the pool, his back still to her. She could see the play of muscles across his shoulders as he sluiced water over his head. When he turned, his movements were slow, unthreatening. His eyes met hers across the steamy surface of the water. "You have a scar," he said, his voice a low murmur. He was not looking at her arm. He was looking at a faint, silvery line just above her collarbone, a childhood memory of a fall from a hayloft. She touched it instinctively. From a long time ago, I was careless. A mark of a lesson learned. He said. He touched the puckered wound on his own shoulder. This was from a soldier's bullet. My father was not so lucky that day. He learned that a piece of paper, a treaty, cannot stop a bullet. They began to talk then, their voices soft in the warm, humid air. The storm outside became a distant, meaningless noise. Here, in this ancient place of healing, they spoke of the things that had marked them, the wounds both visible and invisible. He told her of the winter the smallpox had come, how it had taken his mother, how Nakai's poultices had saved him and Tala but left them with a few faint marks on their skin as a reminder. She told him of her younger brother, taken by a fever that had swept through their settlement when she was 16, a fever she had been helpless to fight. They were not a soldier and a nurse, an Apache and a white woman. They were two people who had known loss, who understood the fragility of life. The water and the steam and the shared stories stripped away the labels, the prejudices, the fears, leaving only the simple, unadorned truth of their shared humanity. He moved toward her then, slowly, his steps silent in the water. He stopped in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The air was thick with unspoken emotion. The fear was gone, replaced by a trust that had been forged in chaos and tempered in this quiet, sacred space. He reached out and gently traced the line of her scar with his fingertip. His touch was electric, sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the water's heat. She looked up at his face, at the strong lines of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his dark eyes. She saw the weight he carried as a leader, the sorrow he held for his people, and the deep, abiding strength that allowed him to endure it all. She raised her own hand and touched the long, thin scar on his ribs, her fingers exploring the raised, smooth tissue. It was a part of him, a part of his story. The space between them dwindled to nothing. Their bodies were inches apart in the warm, swirling water, in the misty steam. Dazin placed his forehead against hers, a gesture of profound intimacy and connection. His voice was a raw whisper, barely audible above the sound of the water. "Don't be afraid, Eleanor," the Apache chief whispered, his skin warm against hers. It was not a command, it was a release, a permission to let go of the last vestiges of fear, of doubt, of the world that had tried so hard to keep them apart. She was not afraid, not anymore. She leaned into him, her hands moving from his chest to his shoulders, and he wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. They held each other tightly in the warm water. Two survivors in a storm, finding shelter not just in the cave, but in each other. His kiss was slow, respectful, a question and an answer all in one. It was a promise of alliance, a joining of two worlds in the heart of the storm. Outside, the wind howled its fury, but inside the cavern, there was only the sound of their breathing and the gentle lapping of the water as the night closed in around them. They were a team now, bound by something stronger than shared danger. They were bound by shared truth. The storm had scrubbed the world clean. They emerged from the cave into a morning of impossible clarity, the air washed of dust, the red rocks gleaming as if freshly painted. The journey back towards the fringes of the settled world was tense, a silent passage through a land that felt both beautiful and hostile. Dazin and Tala left her at the same ridge overlooking Wilcox, but this time it was different. When Dazin met her gaze, it was a look of shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in the heat of the earth. "The truth is a heavy stone. Eleanor Monroe," he said, his voice low. "It is hard to carry, but it is also a powerful weapon. Do not let them take it from you." Eleanor found Miguel in the back room of the town's small printing press, the air thick with the smell of ink and lead. He was setting type for the next edition of his newspaper, his brow furrowed in concentration. The relief on his face when he saw her was so profound it was almost painful. "They are saying you helped the prisoner escape," he said in a hushed, urgent voice. "Pike is furious. He has men searching everywhere." "Let them search," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "I need a place to work, a place with no windows. I need to see what my camera saw." He understood immediately. His gaze flickered to the heavy satchels containing her photographic equipment. Deputy Calloway, with her unshakable adherence to procedure, had indeed prevented Pike from seizing them. She had logged them as Eleanor's personal property and stored them in her office, releasing them to Miguel with a stern warning that whatever he and Eleanor were doing, they had better be right. Miguel led her to the cellar of the print shop, a cool, damp space that smelled of earth and aging paper. It was perfect. While he stood guard, Eleanor began the delicate, alchemical process of her work. She mixed the collodion, the syrupy, ether-scented liquid that would form the sensitive skin on her glass plates, in the dim, safe light of a red lantern. She poured the mixture onto a clean plate, tilting it carefully until a perfectly even film coated the surface. She had several plates from her time in the valley. She chose one she had taken from a high ridge, a sweeping vista of the landscape. She remembered seeing small figures in the distance, riders moving near the base of a canyon wall, and she had taken the picture to capture the scale of the land, the way it dwarfed the people within it. She had thought they were Dazin scouts. She submerged the plate in the silver nitrate bath, counting the seconds in the tense silence. Then she placed the dripping, light-sensitive plate into its holder, her movements practiced and precise. Now came the moment of truth. She exposed the plate to the light of a clean, burning lamp for a few seconds, then began the developing process, pouring the pyrogallic acid solution over the slick surface. The image appeared like a ghost materializing from the ether. First the highlights, the bright sky and the sunlit edges of the rocks. Then, slowly, the deeper shadows, the details emerging from the murky background. She watched, her breath held, as the distant figures resolved themselves. She leaned closer, her heart beginning to pound. They were not Apache, they were white men, 4 of them. They were gathered around a pile of goods, the stolen mailbags and luggage from the stagecoach robbery. And one of them, the man who seemed to be in charge, was not wearing a cowboy hat. He wore a dark, rounded bowler hat, the kind favored by city men, by detectives, by Pinkertons. "Miguel," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Come and see this." He came to her side, peering at the wet, glistening plate. The image was a negative, the colors inverted, but the details were sharp and damningly clear. The truth, fragile and captured in a thin film of silver on a piece of glass. "This changes everything," Miguel breathed. "This is the proof. Ruth must see this." They formulated a plan in hushed whispers. Miguel would contact the deputy. He would tell her they had concrete evidence that would exonerate the Apache and expose the conspiracy. They would meet at a neutral, secluded location, a place where they could not be easily observed. They chose Cottonwood Gulch, a dry riverbed flanked by steep, rocky walls, a few miles west of town. They would meet at dusk. Eleanor felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. It felt too simple, too easy. But the photograph was a fire in her hands. It was a weapon, as Dazin had said, and she had to use it. As the sun began its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land, Eleanor and Miguel rode out of town. Eleanor carried the precious glass plate in a specially padded wooden box, wrapped in velvet. It felt impossibly fragile, a thin pane of glass against the weight of so many powerful men's lies. Cottonwood Gulch was quiet. The air was still and cool. The towering walls of the gulch were stained red by the setting sun. It was a beautiful, lonely place, and it was a perfect trap. The feeling that something was wrong started as a prickle on the back of her neck. The silence was too deep. There were no birds, no crickets, just the soft plod of their horses' hooves in the sandy wash. They reached the designated meeting spot, a small clearing near a cluster of weathered boulders. Ruth was not there. "Maybe we are early," Miguel said, though he too was scanning the tops of the canyon walls, his hand resting near the butt of the pistol tucked into his belt. Then they heard the sound, the metallic click of a dozen rifle hammers being cocked. It seemed to come from all around them, from the rocks above, from the shadows ahead. "Well, well," a familiar voice drawled, dripping with false bonhomie. "Look what we have here, the runaway nurse and the scribbling reporter." Captain Harlan Pike stepped out from behind a large boulder, a smug, triumphant look on his handsome face. He was not alone. At least 10 men, a mix of his own soldiers and rough-looking civilians, emerged from the shadows, their rifles all aimed at Eleanor and Miguel. "It seems Deputy Calloway was unavoidably detained," Pike said with a cruel smile. "She sends her regrets." Eleanor's blood ran cold. He had been watching them. He had known their every move. "It is over. Pike," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "I have proof. I have a photograph of the real robbers." Pike laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "A photograph? You mean this photograph?" He held up a shattered piece of glass, the image on it destroyed. He must have sent men to search the print shop cellar after they left, but Eleanor had been careful. She had made 2 plates. The one he held was a decoy, a landscape she had intentionally left behind. The real proof was still in the box at her saddle. "You are a fool if you think a piece of glass can stop men like Magnus Voss," Pike sneered. "Progress is coming to this valley. Miss Monroe, and you, your reporter friend, and your savage lover are standing in the way." He nodded to his men. "Take them," as 2 of the rougher-looking men started toward them. A high, sharp whistle cut through the air. It was followed instantly by the thud of an arrow embedding itself in the wooden stock of a soldier's rifle. Everyone froze, looking up. On the rim of the canyon, silhouetted against the last of the dying light, stood Tala. She had another arrow knocked in her bow, her form a study in deadly grace. Before Pike could react to this new threat, another sound split the air. Not an arrow this time, but the crack of a rifle. The signal lantern one of Pike's men had been preparing to light exploded in a shower of sparks and shattered glass, plunging the gulch into a deeper twilight. The shot had come from the other side of the canyon. "Dazin!" Ambush Pike roared, his face contorted with fury. He had walked into a trap of his own. The gulch erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed from the rock walls, the muzzle flashes stark and terrifying in the gloom. Miguel drew his pistol and fired back, providing cover. "Eleanor, go!" he yelled, pushing her toward her horse. A dark shape materialized beside her. It was Dazin, his face a grim mask of concentration. "This way," he commanded, grabbing the reins of her horse. "Tala will keep them busy." He did not lead her back the way they had come, but toward the sheer canyon wall. For a panicked moment, she thought they were trapped. Then she saw it. A narrow, dark channel cut into the rock, barely wide enough for a horse. It was an old flume, built by beavers long ago and enlarged by years of flash floods. Dazin urged his horse into the narrow passage, pulling her horse along behind him. The sounds of the gunfight faded, replaced by the clatter of hooves on stone. They were safe. They had escaped. But as they emerged from the other side of the flume, Eleanor looked back. She saw Pike's men overwhelming Miguel, a half-dozen of them wrestling him to the ground. She saw them bind his hands. He was a prisoner. A wave of guilt and despair washed over her, so powerful it almost knocked her from the saddle. She had done this. She had brought him into this. In her quest to expose the truth, she had led her friend into a cage. Dazin stopped and looked at her, his expression grim. He saw the anguish on her face. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply reached out and took the wooden box from her saddle. He opened it and carefully removed the glass plate, holding it up in the fading light. The image was still there. The silent figures. The damning truth. It was unbroken. It was all they had left. "We did not lose," he said, his voice low and fierce. "We just have not won yet." But as Eleanor looked from the fragile plate in his hand to the dark, empty gulch where her friend had been taken, the victory felt impossibly far away. The truth was as sharp as a knife, but tonight it felt like she was the one who was bleeding. The valley was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. They returned to find a community holding its breath, the news of Dazin's capture and escape having arrived with the first light, carried by a scout who moved like the wind. The quiet joy of their home was gone, replaced by a grim, watchful silence. Eleanor's guilt over Miguel was a physical weight, a stone in her gut. She had walked into Pike's trap, and her friend had paid the price. Dazin wasted no time on regret. He was a leader, and his people's fear was a fire he had to bank. He spoke to them, his voice calm and steady, reassuring them that their strength was not in walls of stone but in their knowledge of the land, in their unity. But even as he spoke, Eleanor saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the heavy burden of a man trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. The blow came 2 days later. The first sign was a flicker of movement on the high rim of the canyon, a glint of sun on something metallic, then another and another. Within an hour, the entire valley was sealed. Blue-coated cavalrymen were silhouetted against the sky on every ridge, their positions strategic, their rifles ready. They had been found. Pike had brought the full weight of the United States Army to their door. And he had brought allies. Mixed in with the soldiers were harder-looking men, civilians in dusty range clothes with a predator's stillness about them. They carried expensive rifles and wore their pistols tied low. Eleanor recognized their type. They were not fighting for a flag. They were fighting for a wage. They were Magnus Voss's men, the enforcers of his industrial ambition. A council was held in the cool shade of a rock overhang. Elder Nakai sat with Dazin, Tala, and the other senior warriors. Eleanor was invited to sit with them, her presence accepted without question. She was part of this now. Nakai spoke first, his voice thin but resonant, like dry leaves skittering across stone. He pointed toward the highest, most inaccessible cliffs that formed the back wall of their canyon. "There are trails there the white men do not know," he said, Dazin translating in a low voice. "Paths a goat would fear. We can retreat, go high into the rocks. They cannot follow us there. We can survive." It was the voice of wisdom, of caution. It was the strategy that had allowed his people to endure for generations, disperse, evade, survive. But Dazin shook his head. "They do not want to follow us," he said. "They want us gone. If we run, we give them the valley. We give them the river. And they will hunt us in the mountains until the first snow." He looked around the circle, his gaze lingering on the faces of his people. "No, we will not run this time." Tala, who had been sharpening an arrowhead with fierce, angry strokes, looked up. "Then we fight," she said, her voice a low growl. "We make them pay for every rock, every blade of grass." "We will fight," Dazin agreed. "But not with arrows first. We will fight with words." He turned to look at Eleanor. "We will fight with the truth." His plan was audacious, a gamble that pitted his understanding of his enemy against the raw military power arrayed against them. He would request a parley. He would speak with Pike in the open, in full view of both his warriors and the soldiers. He knew Pike was an arrogant man, confident in his superiority. He would not be able to resist the opportunity to stand before the captured Apache chief and dictate terms. The negotiation would be a lie, a piece of theater. While all eyes were on him and Pike, it would be a signal. The women, the children, and the elders, led by Nakai, would slip away through a narrow cave system at the base of the rear cliff, a secret passage known only to the Chiricahua. Its entrance was hidden behind a waterfall that was now only a trickle, but the path was clear. A series of small, carefully placed smoke signals, looking like random campfires to the soldiers above, would let them know when the way was clear and when it was safe to move. It was a desperate plan, a race against time and suspicion. "And you," Dazin said, his dark eyes locking onto Eleanor's, "you will be our other voice." In the hours before dawn, Eleanor worked in the flickering light of a small, contained fire, using the chemicals she had salvaged. She made several prints from the precious glass plate negative. She worked with a focused intensity, her hands steady despite the tremor of fear in her heart. The image emerged on the treated paper, a ghostly positive this time. The figures were clear, undeniable. The man in the bowler hat, the stolen mailbags, the faces of white men where the world had been told there were Indians. She mounted the best prints onto pieces of stiffened hide, creating a durable portfolio of evidence. Dazin brought her a horse. It was Tala's mare, a beautiful animal, almost pure white, that stood out like a beacon against the red rock. "You will ride to them," he said. "You are not one of my people, and you are not a soldier. You are a witness. Show them the truth you captured. Some of those men, the soldiers, they have a conscience. Your truth may find a home in it." The thought of riding out alone into that sea of armed men made her feel sick with dread. But when she looked at Dazin, at the absolute trust in his eyes, she knew she could not refuse. She had started this journey to heal the sick. Now she had to try to heal a sickness of a different kind, a sickness of greed and lies. She changed out of her buckskin dress and put on the plainest, most practical traveling dress she owned. She did not want to look like one of them. She needed to look like what she was, a civilian woman caught in the crossfire. She tied the portfolio of photographs securely to her saddle. As the sun climbed, casting its first golden rays over the rim of the canyon, Dazin walked to the center of the valley floor, his hands empty at his sides, and called out Pike's name. The response was not long in coming. Captain Pike, flanked by two of his officers and one of Voss's hired guns, rode down a wide trail into the valley. They stopped 100 yards from Dazin. The deadly theater had begun. From a hiding place in the rocks, Eleanor watched them. She saw Dazin speaking, his posture proud and unyielding. She saw Pike's arrogant stance, one hand resting on his hip near his pistol. This was her moment. Taking a deep breath, she swung herself into the saddle of the white mare. She rode out from the cover of the rocks, not fast, but at a steady, deliberate walk. The effect was immediate. A ripple of surprise went through the lines of soldiers on the cliffs, down below. Pike turned, his face a mask of disbelief and then fury as he saw her. He had ordered her confined, had believed her to be neutralized. A soldier on the ridge raised his rifle, aiming at her, before he could fire. A sharp command from Pike echoed up the canyon wall. "Hold your fire." Eleanor kept riding, her eyes fixed on the group of men. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic drumbeat in the sudden, tense silence. The only sound was the crunch of her horse's hooves on the rocky ground. She was halfway there when two new figures appeared at the edge of the scene, near the main trail into the valley. The first was Deputy Ruth Calloway. She sat on her horse, a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm, her face grim and determined. She had not been detained after all. She had been watching, waiting. The second figure was a man on foot, a man whose presence here was so unexpected it made Eleanor's breath catch. It was Reverend Ames, the town's preacher, his face pale but resolute, his Bible clutched in his hand. He did not stay on the sidelines. As Eleanor drew closer to the confrontation, the Reverend walked forward, placing himself directly in her path, a small, black-clad figure in a vast and dangerous landscape. He held up a hand, not toward Eleanor, but toward the lines of soldiers. "In the name of God," he called out, his voice shaking but carrying in the still air, "this is a house of peace no longer, but let us not descend into utter madness. The woman is unarmed. She comes to speak. In the name of all that is decent, you will lower your guns and let the woman pass." His words hung in the air, a challenge of morality against the array of rifles. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Pike stared, his face a thundercloud of rage. He had orchestrated this siege, controlled every element, and now, in a matter of moments, it had spun completely out of his grasp. A small-town deputy, a preacher, and a nurse on a white horse had turned his military operation into a public spectacle. The battle had begun, but as Dawson had intended, the first shots were not bullets, they were words, and they had hit their mark. The standoff was a fragile skin stretched taut over a well of violence. Eleanor held her position, the white mare a stark symbol of truce in the center of the valley floor. Captain Pike's face was a study in frustrated fury. His perfect siege, his clean military solution, had been contaminated by civilians and their inconvenient moralizing. The man standing beside him, the one Eleanor recognized as one of Magnus Voss's chief enforcers, a man with cold, dead eyes named Cutter, leaned in and spoke in a low, venomous whisper. "This has gone on long enough. Captain, Mr. Voss pays for results, not debates." Cutter's hand drifted down, resting on the butt of his pistol. Pike hesitated, his eyes darting from Eleanor to Deputy Calloway, who had moved her horse forward, the shotgun now held across her lap. He was a soldier, and the thought of firing on unarmed white citizens, including a woman of the cloth, gave him pause. But Cutter had no such reservations. "Kill them!" Cutter snarled, his voice carrying in the tense silence. "Kill the evidence." He drew his pistol, aiming not at Eleanor, but at the portfolio of photographs tied to her saddle. Before he could fire, a deafening blast echoed through the canyon. It was not Cutter's pistol. It was Ruth Calloway's shotgun. The shot was not meant to kill, but to disarm. The heavy buckshot tore into Cutter's hand and wrist, sending his pistol flying and reducing his hand to a mangled ruin. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and agony, and staggered back. That single deliberate shot shattered the fragile peace. It was the spark that ignited the dry tinder of hatred and fear. One of Voss's other men, seeing his commander fall, raised his rifle and fired wildly. The bullet went wide, but it was enough. The valley floor erupted into a maelstrom of gunfire. The cavalrymen on the ridges, disciplined and trained, held their fire, their orders to contain, not to massacre. But Voss's men had no such orders. They began firing down into the valley, their targets indiscriminate. Apache warriors, who had been hidden in the rocks, returned fire, their shots precise and economical. The carefully orchestrated parley had devolved into a chaotic, swirling firefight. In the confusion, Dasein moved. He was not a man to stand still in a storm of lead. He sprinted for a high, knife-edged ridge of rock that dominated one side of the valley, a natural fortress. Pike, seeing his prize trying to escape, his rage boiling over, ran after him, drawing his own revolver. The confrontation was no longer about armies. It had become a personal duel. Eleanor, caught in the middle, urged the white mare toward the relative cover of the rocks where Reverend Ames was trying to shelter. As she did, she saw a movement near the main trail. It was a wagon, a simple buckboard, lurching into the valley, driven by none other than Miguel Ortega. He was not alone. Silas Blackwood, the rancher whose cattle had stampeded, a man who had once been Eleanor's suitor, sat beside him, holding a rifle. In the back of the wagon were a half-dozen other townsfolk, armed and looking grim. Ruth had not come alone. She had brought the town with her. Miguel was not just a passenger. In the back of the wagon, he had set up Eleanor's heavy wooden camera on its tripod. A strange, silent cannon in the midst of the battle. He was fumbling with the plates, trying to capture the chaos, to create a new, living photograph of the truth. Cutter, clutching his ruined hand, saw him with a roar of fury. He picked up a rifle with his good hand and took aim at Miguel. No, Eleanor screamed. She spurred the white mare, galloping across the open ground, placing herself and her horse between Cutter's rifle and the wagon. It was a desperate, instinctive act of protection. A bullet whizzed past her head. Another struck the wooden leg of the camera tripod, splintering the wood and sending the heavy apparatus crashing to the ground. Miguel was safe, but the camera, her tool of truth, was broken. She leaped from the horse, her focus now on the duel unfolding on the high ridge. Dasein and Pike were locked in a desperate struggle on the narrow spine of rock, a sheer drop on either side. It was a primal fight, a clash of two worlds. Pike was stronger, heavier, but Dasein was faster, more agile, using the terrain to his advantage. They grappled, their hands locked, their bodies straining. Pike managed to land a heavy blow, staggering Dasein. As Dasein stumbled back, his heel slipped on a patch of loose scree at the very edge of the cliff. For a heart-stopping moment, he teetered on the brink. Pike lunged, not to push him, but to steady himself for a final, killing blow. But his own footing was unsure. He overextended, and with a cry of alarm, it was he who lost his balance. He scrabbled for a handhold, his fingers clawing at the rock, but found nothing. He fell, but he did not plunge into the canyon below. As he dropped, Dasein, who had regained his balance, reached out. His hand shot forward and clamped onto Pike's wrist, his grip like iron. The soldier dangled over the precipice, his face a mask of shock and terror. His life held in the hand of the man he had tried to kill, the man he had called a savage. The entire valley seemed to fall silent. The scattered gunfire died away. Everyone, soldier, townsman, and warrior alike, stared up at the impossible tableau on the ridge. Dasein strained, the muscles in his back and shoulders cording with the effort of holding the dead weight of his enemy. He could have opened his hand. He could have let Pike fall, and no one would have blamed him. It would have been justice, a fitting end. But he did not. With a great guttural cry of exertion, he heaved, pulling the captain up, dragging him back onto the safety of the ledge. Pike lay on the rock, gasping for air, looking at Dasein with a dawning, horrified understanding. He had been beaten, not by strength, but by a code of honor he did not possess. The concepts of savage and civilized had been turned completely upside down. Down below, the fight was over. Ruth Calloway, flanked by Silas Blackwood and the other armed citizens, had Voss's remaining men covered, the cavalrymen. Seeing their captain defeated and then saved in such a profound way, made no move to intervene. Their loyalty was to their uniform. not to Magnus Voss's hired thugs. Ruth walked forward, her face set like stone. She carried a pair of iron manacles. She did not look at Dazin. She looked at Pike, who was slowly, painfully, pushing himself to his feet. "Captain Harlan Pike," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence. "By the authority of the Arizona Territory, I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy, for incitement to violence, and for the murder of federal mail carriers." She held up a sheaf of papers, an affidavit, sworn by Mr. Ortega, based on the evidence provided by Miss Monroe, a warrant, signed by the circuit judge in Tucson this morning. Pike's own men, 2 young sergeants, climbed the ridge. They did not look at their captain with hatred, but with a deep, weary disillusionment. Without a word, they took the manacles from Ruth and secured Pike's wrists behind his back. The architect of the valley's misery had been brought down not by an army, but by a photograph, a reporter's pencil, a deputy's courage, and an act of mercy he could never comprehend, as the first drops of a sudden, unseasonable rain began to fall. Eleanor looked at Dazin, who was making his way down from the ridge. His face was bruised. He was bleeding from a cut on his cheek, but his eyes were clear. The blood and the rain mingled on his skin, washing the dust of battle away, a baptism in the aftermath of the storm. The war for the valley was over. The long, difficult struggle for peace was just beginning. Write Part 9 of the story in English following the memorized outline, about 2,500 words long. Return only the content of this part in English. Omit any headings introducing sections or introducing the result. If any character is a doctor, write it out as doctor and do not abbreviate as doctor. Include only the story content. Do not use abbreviations. If there are any abbreviations, you must write out the full form of the word. Remove all section headings or introductions to paragraphs. Do not use special characters such as n and underscore, hash, asterisk, 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 greater than, double greater than, less than, double less than, left bracket, right bracket, hyphen, underscore, left parenthesis, right parenthesis, double quote, single quote, triple less than, triple greater than, hash, asterisk, double asterisk, triple asterisk. And if there are Roman numerals, convert them to lowercase numbers. Character names in the story must be common American names from 1850. 1900 do not use the name Clara. If there are words or content that are too sensitive for community guidelines and advertiser-friendly principles on YouTube, replace them with gentler wording without losing the meaning of the story. And absolutely do not include any acts of abuse toward children or minors. Return the result to me here in the chat, not using a document box. Note, only continue with Part 9 connected logically to Part 8. You do not need to rewrite Parts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Here is the outline content for Part 9. Fan 9. Nuak Chai Lai and Fien Toang Yuai Hien Quan Falling Action. Su Kien Chin Vos Bi Fan Fui, Sosak Hoilo, Peak Bigyai Vetuson. Di Tran Mo Fien Toa Hien Quan Dan Chu Bien Quang Loi Kai Qua Ruth, An Qua Clara, Baibao Qua Miguel, Duandap Dinchi, Thuang Thoyet Nguan Nuak Kodai Din Apache. Nan Vat Fat Trian Silas Chapnahan Buang Te Tin Ku, Reverend Ames Jiang Vikong Lilon Hondin Kien. Hai Huok Ne Miguel Kobi Bachi de Lai Tu Liu. Tala Loam Lan Sao Lai Tu Liu Dong de Ai Troy. Nipha Ni Chualan, Dat Nen Trat Tu Moi. Hien Tien Trin Tu Dui. The rain fell with a soft, steady rhythm, washing the cordite haze from the air and turning the red dust of the canyon floor into a dark, slick mud. It was a cleansing rain, a baptism for a valley that had just witnessed the ugly birth of a new and fragile peace. Captain Pike, his face a mask of disbelief, was led away by his own sergeants, his dreams of conquest and glory dissolving in the quiet drizzle. Cutter and the rest of Magnus Voss's hired guns were disarmed and put under the watchful eyes of Silas Blackwood and the other townsmen, their bluster and menace gone, replaced by the sullen silence of defeat. The return to Wilcox was not a victory parade. It was a slow, sober procession of weary people, Apache and white, moving through a landscape that seemed to be breathing a long, slow sigh of relief. The cavalry, under the command of a young, shaken lieutenant, followed at a distance, their duty now a grim escort for the man who had led them so far astray. Townspeople emerged from their homes, their faces a mixture of fear, confusion, and dawning wonder as they saw the strange Assembly Deputy Calloway riding point, Eleanor and Miguel in the wagon with the broken camera, and just behind them, Dawson, Tala, and a dozen Apache warriors, their weapons sheathed, their expressions unreadable. The heart of the town, the wide porch of the general store, became an impromptu courtroom under the gray, weeping sky. It was not a trial of law, for that would happen in Tucson. It was a trial of truth, a reckoning for a community that had been fed on lies for too long. Deputy Ruth Calloway stood on the top step, the rain dripping from the brim of her hat. She was not a grand orator, but her voice was clear and steady, and it carried the weight of unshakable fact. She spoke of the illegal survey stakes, of the falsified land office maps she had found in Pike's field desk, and she held up a thick, leather-bound ledger. "This afternoon," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd, "I searched the temporary office of the Voss Mining and Railroad Concern. I found their account books." She opened the ledger. Payments to a man named Cutter and his associates, payments for security services, payments for disruption of local hostels, and a series of very large payments, in cash, to a holding company in St. Louis that is wholly owned by Captain Harlan Pike. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The conspiracy was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a matter of simple, sordid arithmetic. Then it was Eleanor's turn. She did not have her camera, but she had the prints. She tacked them to the wooden support posts of the porch awning, the images stark and clear in the gray light. She pointed to the men around the stolen mailbags, to the bowler hat, to the faces that belonged not to the desert but to the back alleys of eastern cities. "This is the truth I saw," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is what they tried to kill to keep you from seeing. They did not want the land for progress. They wanted the water for profit. They manufactured an enemy so they could steal from all of you, from the town, from the ranchers, from the people of this valley." Miguel was the final witness. He stood on the buckboard of his wagon, a sheaf of hastily scribbled notes in his hand, his reporter's instincts overcoming his exhaustion. He read his story aloud, not with the dry detachment of a journalist, but with the passion of a man who had seen the truth with his own eyes. He told of the ambush in Cottonwood Gulch, of his capture, of the things he had overheard in Pike's camp. He wove together Ruth's facts and Eleanor's images into a single, undeniable narrative of greed and deception. When he finished, a deep silence fell over the assembled townsfolk. They looked from the photographs to the grim faces of Voss's captured men. And then they looked at Dawson, who stood with Nakai and Tala at the edge of the crowd. He was not a monster. He was not a savage. He was a man who had been trying to protect his home. The prejudice that had been a pillar of their community for so long began to crumble, turning to the dust of shame under the cleansing rain. Silas Blackwood, his rifle now resting forgotten in the crook of his arm, made his way through the crowd to where Eleanor stood. He stopped in front of her, his expression a mixture of awe and a quiet, sad acceptance. He had once dreamed of a simple life with her, a life of fences and family on his ranch, but he saw now that she was meant for a different, larger world. "You were always seeing things other folks missed, Eleanor," he said, his voice low. "I just never understood the pictures you were looking at." He glanced over at Dawson, who was watching them, his expression neutral. "You found your place. It is not the one I would have chosen for you, but I can see that it is where you belong." He gave a small, sad smile and tipped his hat. "Be happy." And with that, he walked away. A good man who had learned a hard lesson and had the grace to accept it. Later, as the tension began to ease and coffee was brought out from the saloon, Miguel found himself standing near Tala, He was basking in the glow of his journalistic triumph, accepting congratulations from the townspeople. It was a calculated risk. "Of course," he said with a dramatic flair to a small audience. "Allowing myself to be captured. But a reporter must go where the story is. You get a much better quality of information when your hands are tied behind your back." Tala, who was cleaning her bowstring with a piece of oiled leather, looked up at him, her dark eyes completely devoid of amusement. "The next time you decide to gather information by getting yourself tied up," she said, her voice flat, "do not expect me to cut the ropes for you. Learn to use your teeth." Miguel's bravado evaporated, and he simply stared at her, speechless for once in his life. The following Sunday, the pews in Reverend Ames's small church were fuller than they had been in years. His sermon was not about fire and brimstone. It was about seeing. He spoke of the mote in one's own eye, of the danger of judging a neighbor based on the color of his skin or the language of his prayers. "We stood on the edge of a great darkness this week," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction. "And we were saved, not by the might of armies, but by the courage of a few who chose to see the truth instead of the convenient lie. Justice is not a gift from on high. It is a garden we must tend here on this earth, together. It requires clear eyes, an open heart, and the courage to stand for a neighbor, even a neighbor you do not yet understand." The dam project was suspended indefinitely, its foundation of lies washed away. Pike and his co-conspirators were taken to Tucson to face a federal trial. And on the porch of the general store, a week after the battle, a new kind of council was held. Deputy Calloway presided, not with a shotgun, but with a pot of fresh coffee and a ledger of her own. Silas Blackwood was there, representing the ranchers. Several members of the town council were present, and sitting at the table with them, as equals, were Dazin and Elder Nakai. The talk was not of war or treaties. It was of water, of shared access, of fair distribution, of ensuring that the river, the lifeblood, would continue to nourish everyone. From the corn in Nakai's garden to the cattle on Silas's ranch to the good people of Wilcox. The conversation was slow, difficult, and sometimes tense. Decades of mistrust could not be erased in a single afternoon. But it was a beginning, the foundation of a new order, built not on fear, but on a shared, hard-won truth, was finally being laid. The healing had begun. The seasons turned. The cleansing rain of that climactic day gave way to a long, gentle autumn, and the river, now flowing freely, became a symbol of the town's new, cautiously optimistic rhythm. The trial in Tucson was a distant affair, a matter of headlines in Miguel's newspaper, which now ran a regular column titled "Our Neighbors in the Valley," featuring stories and sketches of Chiricahua life. Magnus Voss's empire of greed had begun to unravel, his name a curse on the lips of men who had lost their fortunes betting on his lies. Life settled into a new shape, a pattern woven from two different threads. The old building that had served as Voss's temporary office was purchased by the town council and given to Eleanor, with the help of Silas Blackwood, who was surprisingly adept with a hammer and saw. She transformed it. The front became the Wilcox Clinic, a clean, bright space with shelves of bottled medicines and a sturdy examination table. But the back was her sanctuary. It was a fully equipped dark room, a place where she could continue her work of capturing the light. Her clinic became a place of healing for both the body and the soul, a place where truth was developed in more ways than one. Dazin, too, found a new role. He was still the chief of his people, their anchor and their guide. But his world had expanded. Twice a week, he would ride into town, not as a warrior, but as a teacher. In the large meadow behind the church, he started a class. His students were a mix of Apache boys and the children of the town settlers. He taught them the language of the land, how to read tracks in the dust, how to find water, how to know which plants gave nourishment and which held poison. He taught them not just how to survive, but how to see, how to listen, how to be a part of the world around them instead of just a conqueror of it. Eleanor would often watch from the window of her clinic, a quiet pride swelling in her chest as she saw the children, their initial shyness forgotten, gathered in a tight, captivated circle around him. The union between them was not a thing of words. Not at first. It was a quiet, steady fact, as real and constant as the mountains that cradled the valley. But there came a day when a more formal recognition was needed. A ceremony to mark the joining of their two lives, their two worlds. It happened in two parts. The first was in the valley, at the foot of the oldest, most weathered saguaro. Elder Nakai presided, his voice a dry, rustling whisper like the wind through the leaves. There were no crowds, only a small circle of their closest family, Tala. Her fierce eyes softened with a rare, genuine happiness. Nakai and Miguel, who had been invited as a witness, his pencil and notebook for once put away. Dazin did not give her a ring of gold. He took her hand and slipped a simple, beautiful circlet of polished turquoise onto her finger. It was the color of the sky after a storm, the color of hope. "A life is a circle," Nakai said, his words translated by Dazin in a low, reverent voice. "It has no beginning and no end. You have found the other half of your circle. Walk it together. Be the shelter for each other in the storm. Be the water for each other in the drought. Let your two fires burn as one, to warm a single home." They did not exchange vows in the way Eleanor's people did. They simply stood before Nakai, their hands joined, and looked into each other's eyes. In that shared gaze, every promise was made, every vow understood. The second part of the ceremony was in Wilcox that evening. It was not a wedding. It was a celebration, a feast to honor the new accord between the town and the valley. The entire town turned out. Long trestle tables were set up in the main street, laden with food. There was roasted beef from Silas's ranch, fresh baked bread from the baker's wife, and corn and squash brought down from the valley. It was awkward at first. The townspeople clustered at one end of the tables, the Apache at the other, a visible gap of history and mistrust between them. Then Deputy Ruth Calloway, a woman of few words but decisive action, picked up a coffee pot. She walked to the center of the gap and began pouring coffee for everyone, Apache and white alike, her steady, no-nonsense presence a bridge across the divide. Reverend Ames followed her, offering slices of apple pie with a gentle, inclusive smile. Slowly, tentatively, the two groups began to mingle. A rancher found himself discussing the quality of the range grass with an Apache hunter. A mother from the town complimented an Apache woman on the intricate beadwork on her child's moccasins. They were small moments, tiny seeds of understanding being planted in the soil of a shared meal. Miguel, his eye for a story ever sharp, saw the moment he had been waiting for. He pulled out his camera, the tripod now expertly mended by the town blacksmith. Everyone, look here," he called out, his voice full of infectious cheer. A picture to mark the day, a picture for the history books. He arranged them for a group photograph, a chaotic, wonderful jumble of people. He insisted that Dazin and Eleanor stand in the center. He placed Deputy Calloway on one side and Reverend Ames on the other. He coaxed Tala into the front row, where she stood with her arms crossed, trying and failing to look stern. He even managed to get Silas Blackwood to stand near the edge of the group, his expression one of proud, quiet acceptance. Miguel ducked under the dark cloth, made his final adjustments, and the flash powder went off with a bright, percussive pop, capturing the improbable, beautiful, fragile new reality of their world in a single frame of light and silver. Later that night, long after the last of the embers from the feast had died down, Eleanor and Dazin sat on the small porch of her clinic. A cool breeze whispered down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and dust. The sky above was a vast, velvet darkness, strewn with a breathtaking clarity of stars. She had built her home here, a place that was both hers and a part of the town. He, in turn, had brought his world out of the shadows of the valley and into the light. They had not asked each other to change, only to make space for the other to be whole. She looked at him, at his strong, quiet profile silhouetted against the starlight. His face was turned toward the dark line of the mountains to the north. "A scout brought word today," he said, his voice a low murmur, not breaking the peace of the night. "There is talk in the mining camps, talk of a new railroad. They plan to build it north of here, through the Dragoon Mountains." Eleanor felt a familiar, cold whisper of apprehension. The railroad. The great, iron engine of progress that cared little for the lives it disrupted. The source of Magnus Voss's power. A force that had almost destroyed them all. The fight was not over. It would never be over. There would always be another railroad, another mining claim, another man with a silver cup waiting to be filled. She did not feel the same despair she once might have. She looked at the sleeping town, at the peaceful darkness that shrouded the valley, at the man beside her. They were not alone anymore. They had faced the darkness and had not been broken. They had built something here, something stronger than fear. She reached out and laid her hand on his chest, her palm resting over the faint, puckered scar on his shoulder. It was a part of him, a mark of the life he had lived, a testament to his survival. He turned his head and looked at her, his dark eyes full of a deep, unwavering love. He placed his own hand over hers, his fingers warm and strong, pressing her hand against his heart. The life that beat beneath their hands was a quiet, powerful rhythm, a defiant pulse against the vast silence of the desert. It was stronger than bullets, stronger than lies, stronger than fear. They would face the future, whatever it brought, together. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.